to get everyone started and mute everyone. Give us just 1 second.
And this is for your
Yes, correct.
Give us just a second, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get everyone on mute and get started. All right, we're just getting everyone in and started. We have a couple hundred people joining us today, so I want to make sure we give everyone an opportunity to join us before we get started. And I see some familiar faces, which is really lovely. We've got most everyone in. We've got a couple of 100 people, 120 some people joining us, but I think we'll go ahead and get started if everyone's all right with that. And we'll just continue to let people in as they join us. So welcome everyone. I am so glad to see all of you here, some familiar faces from all over the country, which is really lovely. I see Leslie from Texas, which is amazing, and Suzanne from right down the street from me, and all others. There are so many faces. My name is Jennifer Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director of LCSW New Jersey. And I'm really glad that you are here joining us today. I'm with Dr. Letitia Sampson. She's an LCSW and a phenomenal social worker and expert on children and families. And I'm really glad that she's here to help us with this conversation. And before we get started, I wanted to just make sure that we took a moment to recognize that today is Juneteenth and we're celebrating that. And it's a really important day in our history as Americans, and feels more so important for us to acknowledge it this year, the celebration of the emancipation of enslaved Americans. And now more than ever, we have such work to be done in our country. And part of that is having conversations with our kids and really helping them understand what's happening in our world so that they're prepared to take on the challenges before us. So that's what we're going to have a conversation about here today. I know as a mom, I have questions and I'm struggling through this with all of you. I'm going to let Dr. Sampson come on and speak for a couple of minutes, but then there's going to be an opportunity for everyone here to ask questions as well. So feel free to put them in the chat box over to your right-hand side, or raise your hand and we'll start to dive into this together. Sound good? Dr. Sampson, welcome and thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Jennifer. Thank you to LCSW New Jersey for hosting this forum because it's super important. So just to give everyone a little bit about me, my name is Dr. Letitia Sampson. I am the Executive Director of Great Joy Counseling and Consulting Services in Westfield, New Jersey. I'm also the CEO of Erase the Divide, which is a nonprofit organization based in Newark, New Jersey, to address the disparity of technology in communities of color. So I am so excited about this conversation because I think it's one that we all need to have. So thank you so much.
Thank you. You know, I think one of the challenges that I have heard a lot from my friends and colleagues and even myself is just where do we start? Where do we start with this conversation, and at what age? And I would love if maybe we could just start there with the real basics. What age and where? What are your thoughts?
Okay, yeah, sounds good. So I think the first thing to know for all of the parents and for social workers out there is that there is not one specific answer. There is not one right answer and a bunch of wrong answers. I think it's important, though, that we establish and develop some guidelines. I do not believe it is ever too early to start talking about race. Right. So when we think back to the experiments through the years with the research being done about the dolls, etc., where children were able to recognize racial differences as early as 2 years old. So it is never too early to start talking about race. I think that with the climate and all the things that are happening in our nation, we need to acknowledge that children are scared, they're confused, they're angry, and not talking about it does not help. We have to be willing to confront racism directly and to educate ourselves and our children about it so that they can be empowered and change can really come.
Thank you for that. One of the things that I've seen a lot posted about and that I'm really struggling with, and maybe some of you here today will relate as well, is the idea that, oh, well, I don't raise my children to see color, right? My kids don't inherently see color. And I struggle with that. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, the research.
Absolutely, Jenna. I think so many people struggle with this, but it's important that we really change that narrative, right? Because if we don't see color, that means we are also not seeing the person for all of who they are, right? So when you see me, I want you to see that I'm a Black woman, right? I want you to be able to recognize that, and I want you to be able to affirm that. To not do that can definitely give children the impression that there is something wrong with individuals who are non-white. So we have to be able to confront that, right? We have to ensure that our children know that racism and discrimination and prejudice is what's wrong, not the color of individual skin. So to not acknowledge that actually fosters the problem.
Thank you. I'm wondering if there's an age where you think that we should be allowing our children to start watching and seeing little pieces of what's on the news. It's interesting that we're all in this together, but we're also in the middle of a global pandemic. And so our children might not be out seeing it in the way that they would in any other times. Do you have thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Again, I think that it is important that history be a part of conversations with our children, and that includes racism, right? That includes, we should be talking to our children all the time about current events in a very direct, non-generalized way, because I think that it's important to be very specific about what we're saying. So there's a difference in saying, all of these protests are happening because some groups don't treat other groups equally. That's very different than saying, African Americans in America are not treated fairly by police, or they're disproportionately arrested, etc. And obviously we have to use language that, will appeal to our children based on their age, but we have to get away from not wanting to confront these issues head on. It is very important to make it normal to discuss any type of injustices, whether or biases, racism, etc.
I think one of the hardest things for me as a mom, and particularly the mom of a Black son, is just wrestling with my own discomfort in these conversations. Like, what is that? I'm having to battle some of the things within myself, or the way that I was raised, or the prejudice that I've carried forward in my own life. Where do parents start with addressing that? Do you hear that often? Am I the only one?
No, absolutely not the only one. No, I think so many people are struggling and definitely feel lost and feel helpless, because I think that, these messages are so important, and, parents just don't want to do the wrong thing. But unfortunately, Jennifer, I think that in not wanting to do the wrong thing, it actually immobilizes people. And so the conversations are really not as in depth and as meaningful as they should be. So I think that it is important that as parents, right, I'm a mom as well, as social workers, as community leaders and activists, we have to get comfortable with expressing our feelings to our children, right? One thing I say to the parents I work with is that your children must understand that every day is not going to be a 10, right? Like, so every day is not going to be your birthday. Every day is not going to be, you know, your favorite holiday. So we have to be willing to be vulnerable enough with our children to say things like, listen, you know, I had to confront something within myself. I wasn't educated about this issue. This is something that's really hurtful. This is something that's really tough for me to discuss. We have to be willing to say that and lead with that. Our children can definitely sense our vulnerabilities anyway. So I think it's important that we not try to hide that or shield that, but instead be really upfront and direct with it. I think it builds bridges and lets our children know that while we're not perfect, we are also striving to bring about change with these areas.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I feel like as parents, often we want our children just to see us as these pillars of strength and to not let our guard down. This week I took my son, my husband and I took our son to Washington, D.C. and to see really what was happening because he's being raised by two advocates. So of course we would go there. And when he started asking questions as 7-year-olds do, I broke down in tears and really just said, like, this is super hard. This is really difficult. And, you know, he wasn't super confused by it, but we had a really good conversation, and it was a moment of vulnerability for mom and dad. But I think also an opportunity for us to talk about what was happening and how we as a family are going to be part of the solution and our values around that.
I think that's awesome. And I think that, you know, just to piggyback on what you said, Jen.
You're broken up just a little bit, Letitia. Does anybody else see that? Okay. You never know whose internet it's on. Give me 1 second while we see if we can get her back. Oh, technology, right? It's our friend and our foe. Oh, Dr. Sampson. We've got a rocky internet connection. All right, well, she's off for a second. We'll get her back on. I'm going to open it up. I wonder if some people have questions. My son's peeking in over here, so if you have children, have them jump in and say hello.
Hey, I'm back. I'm sorry about that. We had some technical difficulties.
That's
sorry
quite
about
okay.
that, guys. I'm still with you. I'm still with you.
That's quite okay.
Hi.
Oh, see all these people saying hi. One of the questions that have came in, and I'm wondering if you want to speak to it for a second, is how do we address with our children the thought that if they hear that we're supporting Black Lives Matter, it means that we're not supporting all lives, and that dialogue that's happening.
I think that absolutely has to be addressed, because I think that rhetoric is probably one of the most harmful messages that is out right now. You know, I definitely think that children need to recognize that, you know, no one at all, and any type of messaging or branding related to Black Lives Matter is saying that all lives don't matter, or that, you know, our law enforcement officers should be harmed or hurt or any of that. But it is instead shining a light that, unfortunately, for Black people in America, their lives are not treated with equity, right? So the reason why we even have to have organizations like Black Lives Matter is because there is a disparity and there is injustice as it relates to Black people. So we have to be willing to go there and have these ongoing conversations. You know, we can't just wait until there's another hashtag or your child sees it on social media. These conversations, if we're talking about history with our children, we're celebrating events, we need to be able to celebrate them and have these discussions from a real honest, authentic place. And everything about America has not been without stain and without problems. And so we can't present, you know, this pristine perspective to our children that is not based in fact.
I think that's so important. One of the things we talk a lot about as a family is just reading history and understanding the things that maybe you weren't taught in school or you're not going to be taught in school. and bringing in those figures. And, you know, we talk about what does Black Lives Matter mean? What does that, it means that all lives matter, of course, but right now this isn't, you know, the issue. The issue is, you know, that Black lives have not been a priority for our country, and what does that mean, and what can we do to work around?
And I think we have to not just, Jen, rely on our schools to teach our children, right? So you talked about Juneteenth earlier, right? So, you know, I grew up in New Jersey. I was educated in New Jersey public schools, you know, my whole life. And you know, did not know anything about Juneteenth from school. My family taught me about Juneteenth and other significant historical events, but not the schools. So we have to be willing to jump in and really do that work, because so often our children are really not educated properly about what's happening or the real historical lens of what has happened in America.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that's really interesting about that conversation is it's not just geography based, right? Like you grew up in New Jersey and with, you know, I'm going to assume Black parents, and you didn't know about Juneteenth and it wasn't taught in your school systems. But alternatively, I spent a lot of my childhood in Oklahoma. Nobody talked to me about Tulsa. Not a one person in the Midwest has ever talked to me about what happened there. And I think, like, what gaps of history did we miss because people were uncomfortable with the conversation? And how do we as adults, go find out what happened and really learn and educate ourselves about the history, but then also make sure that our children are starting to learn about it? Because I think that frames why we're here today and why it's so important that we take action, because it's
absolutely
generations. There are a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to start getting to those from the group. But I did want to touch on something that we've had a lot of questions about over the last couple of weeks, and myself and friend groups as well. Some of you here might relate to it. The conversation between parents that needs to happen. So one of the things I hear a lot about is how do Black families have conversations with white families and vice versa about the relationship that our children are having. Or, for example, just something super simple, like why, when our sons are at the park together, your white son cannot bring water guns to play with. And how do we have that challenging conversation, because it might impact my Black son in a very different way. And you might not know about that, but how do we, in a loving way, have conversations with our friends about how different our realities are and how different our worries for our children are? Any thoughts or tools?
Absolutely. I think that it is important for us to get comfortable being uncomfortable. It is not easy to talk about racism. It's not easy to talk about, you know, some of the disparities that occur and why our children can't even play freely in the same manner. So we have to really lead with that. I think that sometimes we try to act like it doesn't exist, right? And that kind of just furthers the rhetoric of, I don't see color, everything's equal, everything's the same, which, as I mentioned earlier, is really more harmful. So for me, I think it is really important to be able to say, listen, I need you to understand that Tamir Rice was 12 years old when he was shot in the park and he had a fake gun, right? And what that really means and what that feels like, and not be afraid or want to shy away from it because, you know, we don't want to have difficult conversations. I think there's power in having the difficult conversation, right? We have to really, especially as social workers, be willing to be the advocates, be willing to be the educators for not just, you know, our friend groups or, you know, our religious organizations, but our families, even our spouses, even. We have to be really willing to fill in the gaps, because if we won't do that, who will, right? Like, we're educated and experienced with activism and with educating communities, etc., empowering others. So we have to really, really live it.
Yeah, it can feel like a really difficult conversation to have. And I know, you know, some parents who are on the call too today are probably rumbling with that same discomfort of how do you talk to your friends about it? And taking a step back, and it's making it not about politics, right? Because I think that's what's also being infused today.
Yeah.
It's not about politics. This is not,
No.
I think there are tons of issues we can disagree on in policy and world, but this is about basic human rights and protecting our children and our loved ones and our brothers and our, our husbands, and that's not political in any way. It shouldn't be.
Exactly.
We should all agree on that.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think another thing that would really make these conversations easier, because I took a couple of notes that I thought would be helpful. It is very important at a young age for parents, especially parents of white children, to be very intentional about the types of toys and books that are purchased. Right. And the reason why I am putting a spotlight on parents of white children is because we live in a society where there is a prevalence of images of white children. If you look on the Disney Channel, if you look on Nickelodeon, etc., it is normal to see either white children or racially ambiguous children. Right. So how intentional are parents about diversity? Right? Like, so are you buying your children dolls that look different? I remember when my daughter was born in 2005, it was very important to me that she had dolls of all different shades, all different hair textures that looked very different so that she was comfortable. But, we can't just rely on, ethnic or racial minority communities to do that, right? Like everyone needs to do that, because if you are having your children comfortable with the racial differences from a young age, it's much easier to continue this dialogue and conversation, right? We have to really be intentional about these things.
I think that's such a great point. And I think one of the reasons I feel so passionately about doing that, and particularly, sorry to my white friends here, but also a little not sorry, once you go through that exercise of looking for it, I think you also recognize how difficult it can be, right? To find that diversity. And then I think that also opens up our eyes to like this larger problem of why is it so hard to find a Black
That's right.
Why is it so hard to find diversity in the toys? And even why is it so difficult to find books about, well-known Black leaders? It's incredibly challenging to get age appropriate stuff. And I think unless you live it and you experience it, you don't realize how difficult that can be. Somebody else had a really great question about regarding the police. How do we talk to the kids about what's happening with the police without also demonizing the police and making them fearful? And I feel like that resonates with me today. And I'm not sure if anyone else saw it, but a Black father had shared on social media a picture of his son in their very normal neighborhood, and the police car was driving by, but his son was fearful and was hiding behind the car. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was in his own driveway, but he had said, oh, this is really the state of where we're at, that my son in a very privileged environment is hiding from the police because of the color of his skin. How do we balance that out?
I think it's important to know. I think about that example because I actually saw that clip on social media, and it brought me back to conversations that I had, in the 80s and 90s as a child growing up, and my parents and my aunts and uncles really educating my cousins and I when we learned how to drive about what we would probably face with the police, right? So this was before social media. This was before hashtags. Black families have had to have these conversations for generations because it has definitely been something that has been prevalent. So I think it's important to ensure that our children recognize that it's not the police, an umbrella term, that's the problem. However, there are instances where there are individuals who are on the police force who are not good people, just like there are individuals throughout every walk of life and every profession that are not good people. And unfortunately, these individuals, who are not good people really can ruin it for everyone. And one thing I would do, especially for younger children, preschoolers and early childhood age children, is let them know, think about, their daycare class, or think about their school class, or even at home if they have siblings. Sometimes the behavior of one or two can really spoil the treat, right? So I remember being in, being able to work in different daycares and different things as I was, advancing my professional career. And we would let everyone know that unfortunately the behavior of all was going to be looked at and scrutinized, right? So helping children recognize it's not everyone, but it is really literally some bad apples that really spoil the bunch and spoil the perception, we have to be willing to do the education. We have to be willing to talk about why some children are afraid and what that really means, right? So I think we have to confront it head on, but definitely, ensuring that children recognize the real role of law enforcement, and that is to protect everyone and make everyone feel safe. Unfortunately for, Black Americans, that does not always happen. We have to be willing to say that.
I think that is so true. We have to be able to say both that there are bad actors and there are people who did bad things, but use really simple, child-friendly language. We in our house have, our son is exposed to the news and watches it, and for better or for worse, probably more aware than some of his other 7-year-old counterparts. But one of the things that we've chosen to do is just expose him and have it on and let him really lead the conversation. So it's on in the background. He watches the news. He's so sick of mom in the news, but he'll, come up to me on a Saturday night and sit next to me and say, what's going on in the streets? What's going on? So then we say, hey, there are some bad things that happened and people are upset and this is what it means. And then we are able to introduce the concept of Martin Luther King and what he did. And then it led him down a rabbit hole of learning about the children's marches and how Martin Luther King led those. For those of you who have not read about that, I really encourage you to do so, because I think that's another piece of history that we don't learn about. The children's marches and the children being incarcerated for days on end. But that really has opened up the door for him to say, what's happening, comfortably ask questions, and then he asks for chocolate ice cream, and we go about our business, and we don't bring it back up until he says, hey, what about those children's marches? If I do it, will I be locked up these days? And then you're back to sort of heart-wrenching, other conversations, but we really try to follow his lead at a 7-year-old level. But also a little bit of wine is needed.
Yeah, a lot of wine. I think we also, Jen, have to ensure that our children recognize that many of these events, I think about what you said about the children's marches, etc. These were not things that were long ago. Now, all of our children think that we are prehistoric and dinosaurs, right? I mean, my daughter is 14, and when I tell her, the year I was born, she looks at me like, what? Like, people were around then? Like, you know what I mean? So she definitely is one of those kids who thinks, we have been alive for 200 years. But, I think it's really important that we make it relatable. We make some of these historical events relatable, right? So I think about Ruby Bridges, who was the first African-American child at 6 years old to integrate schools, right, in the South. And so when I think about the fact that Miss Bridges is 62, right? So my parents are younger than Ruby Bridges, right? They are a few years younger than her. When I was explaining that to my daughter, that made it real to her, because it's easy to look at some of these events. They learn about civil rights, etc., as, oh, these things happened 100 years ago. No, they really, really didn't, right? Like, we have to be willing to say, hey, when grandma was a little girl, Black children and white children could not go to school together, right? When daddy was born, this is what was going on in the country. We have to ensure that our children have a gauge of what happened and when it happened, so that they can understand what's happening now.
I love that point. You're so right. And it's not just about the activism too, but like the laws that have developed in our lifetime. We talk a lot about Loving Day in our household, and we talk about just not long ago, our family would have been illegal. And we have a lot of questions about that, and we celebrate it and we talk about it as a family, but making sure that people and our children really understand that we've come a long way, but it's been a very short amount of time. And what does that mean? Also, in sort of empowering them that like they can be part of the change too in a really short amount of time. Like, we've come so far, but also not nearly far enough.
We have so far to go. Exactly.
Right. It's a difficult balance. In other ideas, I'm going to just open it up. I'm scrolling through the comment sections. somebody has questions. They're an assistant director of foster care, and they have a couple of staff on the call. So hello, you guys are doing an awesome job during COVID. I can't even imagine what this has meant for your work. But how can we speak to providers to our children in foster? Let's see. I have staff on here. Can you speak to how we can speak as providers to the children and foster care parents in the program? Tools for people to have conversations.
Absolutely. So I think that we have to be very, again, that word intentional just keeps coming up. We have to be intentional about these conversations. Are we being reactive or are we being proactive, right? So what I would say to that organization is to organize, even if it's something like this, a Zoom call, a training, a conversation where individuals are able to come onto a platform and really discuss these issues. Oftentimes we try to just ignore these issues and kind of hope that if we duck or keep our head down enough, it'll kind of pass us like a wave. We can't do that with this issue anymore, right? That facilitates the problem. So we have to be willing to put ourselves out on the forefront and say, hey, listen, you know, there has been a lot going on in the last few months. We want to be able to do a debriefing call. We want to be able to have a social worker come on and really talk about some of the resources that are available. Here are a list of books that are child friendly and appropriate, where you can talk to the children in your care about what's happening with racism or how to be an ally, etc. There are tons of resources. And what I will do, Jen, is I will send some of those resources to you via email so they can be put on the NASW NJ site. Yep. So individuals can go and get books and, you know, different things that I think will be really, really, really helpful. We have to have the tools. We have to be able to give people something in their hands that they can use.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. I know everyone here is looking for tools and resources. Someone says that Embrace Race is a good resource online too.
Yes, I like Embrace Race. Yep.
I'm going to just open it up. Does anyone else have questions here, either from a professional perspective or also just a mom or grandmothers? I know we've got all different kinds of providers here and families on the phone. I'm going to have you raise your hand if you can, and I'll see if I can see hands raised. Here, I'm going to unmute you. I see a hand raised. There you go. FIS Dahania, I've asked you to unmute
Diana.
yourself.
It's okay. Okay, got it.
Okay.
Diana. I'm from Family Intervention Services. That's what.
Welcome.
Thank you so much for having this. I'm excited to be able to hear such expertise. I'm wondering, as helping professionals, how do we balance being agents of change, for social justice and equity with our clients and their clinical needs? When they're actually verbalizing, topics of prejudice, racism, bias in their sessions. So how do we balance those two things, as helping professionals?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Diana. I think that's a great question. I think that we have to be willing to listen to the experiences of our clients and know that some of their experiences are going to be starkly different than our experiences, because it does not matter how we show up in the world, because we are professionals, we are licensed, credentialed individuals, we still sit in a place of privilege, right? So even with myself as a Black woman, I still have access and entryway, to certain resources that a Black woman who may not have my level of education or experience won't have access to. So we have to be willing to validate the feelings of our clients and also be willing to be vulnerable enough to say, hey, tell me more about that. I don't know what it feels like to be followed by the police on your way to session. I don't know what it feels like to be in an elevator and people are grabbing their purses. Tell me what makes that real for you. Tell me more about it. We have to be willing to put ourselves in the position of ally. We have to be willing to open up the forum for them to really express their experiences. So often we shut our clients down because it's uncomfortable for us, or because we're just not educated about it. So again, we want to kind of duck down and kind of let it pass. No, we have to be willing to explore what's uncomfortable and allow our clients to be teachers. I think that is important.
I love that idea and that acknowledgement that our clients can be our teachers and our friends can be our teachers here, and
That's right.
our colleagues, that we all have so much to learn in this space, and that, you know, for the non-social workers here, just sitting intentionally with our friends to say, you know what, tell me a little bit more about what this has been like for you. What has your experience been, so that I can hear it and the growth that comes from that. And I think even just saying, you know, okay, now that I've heard, you know, one of the things I have challenged people on my Facebook page to do is, you know, ask one of your Black friends what it feels like when they see somebody say, all lives matter as it relates to Black Lives Matter. Like, what does that feel like? And see if you think it's an appropriate response any longer. Because I think that people need to hear how invalidating and just demoralizing it feels, or at least I've been told it feels.
Absolutely. Agreed 100%.
Anyone else have questions they want to raise their hand either on the screen, or if you're not on screen, there is a little raise your hand function. You're super shy. Not a problem. That's okay. We can keep chatting forever. I'm wondering, there's another question that came in. At what point do we as social workers of color stop being held accountable for ensuring that non-colored social workers are consistently working to ensure that they are aware of biases and the work to be skilled and culturally competent practices? Many times social workers and clinicians of color are held to the model minority standard.
Absolutely. I agree with that. And one of the things that I say all the time is that it is not, you know, the job of people of color to educate white Americans about racism. Like, that's not their job, right? So as social workers, while we may have the information, and depending on the scenario, I certainly think that we need to be open and have forums like this, which certainly are educational, but it's important that the individuals that are of color, that are social workers, do not continue to perpetuate that they have to have all the answers, right? Or have to address certain comments or experiences that may be upheld at their places of employment, or even on social media. I mean, I can't tell you the number of comments and questions I've gotten, and sometimes I feel like answering them and sometimes I don't, right? And it's important that, you know, we feel comfortable being guardians of our own selves. One of the things I think is really important, you know, is that, you know, all of us need to have a support system. All of us need to be able to process this ourselves. We are doing this work and offering of ourselves so much, but we also need to be able to debrief. We also need to be able to be okay and have that support. So I would say to absolutely reject the whole, you know, model minority perspective, or that we have to be held to a different standard. And you do that by being vocal. You do that by addressing behavior that can be perceived as a microaggression, or behaviors that can make you uncomfortable. Oftentimes we don't want to say anything because it may not go well, but that not saying anything really leads to, you know, being complicit and adding to the problem. So we have to be willing to speak up.
And I think that's super important, and we don't want to further perpetuate and add to this problem. And the truth is, you know, we have to be our own educators, and it's not up to our colleagues to carry that burden for us.
Exactly.
Joe has a question. How do we respond to white fragility when people go into defense mode to protect themselves, or just put their walls up as it relates to, you know, white privilege?
I think we have to call it out. I think we have to call it out. But again, I think you have to do your own internal self-checks about how, you know, deep you're willing to go with some of this, because it can be damaging to you personally, right? So I can't tell you in the last 3 months how many like people on my friends list, right, that I've had to delete because I'm just not going to entertain certain messages. And while everyone is certainly entitled to their opinion and their perspective, I have to be the guardian for myself, right? And so in order to do that, I have to be willing to say, today is the day I feel like addressing this issue, or today's the day I'm really not there. So I think that we have to be willing to provide the education, but then know when it's time to really exit the boxing ring, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I struggle with is this whole, like, we see it online, and you mentioned Facebook, and just like the Facebook warriors and the aggressive, sharing of opinion. And I think that everyone here is committed to having this conversation, or you wouldn't be here otherwise. Oh, we've got somebody in the background. I'm going to mute folks.
I think you muted.
Yep, I got it muted. But the idea that, we need to call it out. I think you're right, but how do we call it out in a way that also doesn't also make people put their defenses up even higher? Because I think the goal of it is always for us to get past the defensive so that we can help people learn, and like shouting and shaming people. Stop.
You know what? I definitely don't think we need to, shame anyone or anything like that. However, I think that we cannot be it can't be more important to us that we coddle feelings than we address what is happening in our nation, right? Because that is truly the problem. And as social workers, we can't be so politically correct that it's more important that people don't walk away with their feelings hurt than we address systemic racism, institutionalized racism, and implicit bias, and how it impacts people's lives. So I think it's a delicate dance, right? It's a delicate dance because, we certainly can't, just go out guns blazing and, completely alienate people. But at the same time, I am not going to, be a part of the whole white fragility, perspective and not say what needs to be said. The truth is, right, there are places where Black people are not welcome. The truth is there are restaurants that do not treat Black people the same. The truth is Black people disproportionately are jailed or killed by police. We have to say those things because it's the truth, right? I heard a quote in a song some years ago, and it said, "The truth will set you free, but first it'll piss you off." And unfortunately, we have to be willing to piss some people off.
Yeah. No, I agree with you completely. It's just this weird place that I think we see the people sort of Facebooking and being like, "You suck, you suck."
Yes.
And
that's not helpful.
Not helpful. We want to make sure that we're addressing the issues head on, and we're saying, like, this is the reality. This is what we're faced with. And, as much as we can address it head on and be that agent of change in that moment is really important.
Absolutely. Agreed.
I'm just looking through some of the other questions. Did somebody have a question and had muted themselves? No? Okay. So there is a comment that came through, and I think it's also super important, that while this conversation started out about tools to work with our children, that we've also moved into the conversation with adults, and how do we have conversation with adults, which only probably indicates that we're all just super confused and really struggling with this. And as much as it's a conversation about with our children, we also have work to do amongst ourselves before we can help our children.
Exactly.
Somebody has questions that they have seen somebody who sat idly by and never joined the movement out of fear and backlash from more conservative family members. They want recommendations for someone who wants to get involved, but is, for lack of better terms, afraid to do so.
I guess my first question would be, why are you afraid to do so, right? Because we have to really understand that our voices are powerful, and it is not easy to have, conversations around race. Again, you mentioned earlier, Jen, that it's something that really makes people, it gets under people's collars, right? It's not easy. It's not a pleasant conversation. But, my question really to an individual who struggles with that is, your silence equals your agreement, right? So no one is saying you have to throw the mashed potatoes at your dad over the dinner table. However, to not address these issues really means you are complicit and a part of the problem. I think another important thing to recognize is this, because I've been seeing this online. A lot of people have been shamed because of their lack of participation in what is going on, etc. And as I mentioned earlier, I've led protests, but protesting is not for everyone. For some people, it may be sharing an article on social media. For some people, it may be correcting that family member at the dinner table who says something that is biased, right? I think that we all can do our parts. It's important to recognize that comparison really is the thief of joy. And so I can't say, oh, this is what Jen is doing and this is what I'm not doing. You have to do what's comfortable for you, but do something. I have to do what's comfortable for me, but do something. Your something is really something that is individualized and really based on your level of comfort, your level of education, your level of expertise, etc. So if what you can do, as I mentioned, is share a meme or share a resource or tag people in an educational source or watch videos or get a book, you are doing something. Don't compare what other people are doing to what you're doing, because all it does is further the divide. And we want to be able to bring things together.
I really love that, and that idea that we're not supposed to be comparing, because you're right. Everyone has a different starting place and a different comfort level. And, for those who have grown up in super conservative, closed off families, I relate to you on a very spiritual level. And, what my advocacy looks like in, my family life now versus my family and my extended family is very different. So, me and my husband are marching and doing all that we can, but with my extended family, it's, hey, this makes me uncomfortable. You need to stop saying those things around me, right? It can be different in every situation too.
Absolutely. Agreed.
Diana, you've got your hand.
Sorry, if no one else has questions, if I can have the second one. So Dr. Sampson, we have a situation where actually two adolescents are really voicing their own perspective, right? And they are being treated by a Black, strong woman as a therapist. And their views are, George Floyd was a felon. He deserved it. That's what happens when you don't listen, or that's when you don't follow the police instructions. And so it's the person, the therapist, been very impacted regarding, hey, I've worked with this youth for almost, a year and a half or 2 years. And just now I'm learning that this is what this person is thinking. And honestly, this therapist is the person that opens the door for all those, cultural and discussion, sensitive discussion. And this incident brought out that in their therapeutic sessions. And it's happening consistently with these adolescents. And I think it's hard as I'm Latina and I don't know what it is to walk in the body of a Black woman, right? I can only relate to what it is as a Latina woman. But a white client telling you this in your sessions, how would you handle it? What would you do with these adolescents?
You know what? It's so interesting, Diana, that you mentioned that, because I actually had that happen last week with a client of mine, right? So this is a 16-year-old white client, white male client, from an affluent area, and had the exact same rhetoric, right? And so he was saying to me, Leticia, I don't really get it, because as you mentioned, this person should not be held up to the standard, etc. And so what I did was I said, okay, I want to send you something, and then I want you to get back on this Zoom call. And what I sent was a clip of a white male being a white male interaction with the police. And so this male actually was able to take a bat from his vehicle, hit the police officer. The police officer actually ran from the suspect. All right. The suspect then was able to get into the car and ram the police car several times. Okay. So I sent it to that client and I said, okay, with what you said and your perspective, please explain to me if you think this person should have been shot. Right? Should this person have been killed? And why weren't they? And he was silent. He was silent for about 3 minutes. And I'm like, hello, are you here? Are you here? And he was like, wow. Right. So sometimes we have to be willing to do that education in the moment. These things are on YouTube. These things are on YouTube. right? So then in showing the imagery, I think, as a professor, as a social worker, I could have explained it, but him seeing that clip made so much more difference, right? So are we willing to use all of the tools? Our young people are social media driven. They kind of don't believe it just because you say it. They have to see it. Him seeing that, based on how the session went, it made a difference for him. He had to see, wait a minute, whoa, that's not cool. Like, look at what this person did and look at what this person did and look at the outcome. Right? So we have to be willing to use all of the tools that are at our fingertips for our young people to understand that this really is a disparity and is problematic and why. So that would be my suggestion.
Thank you. Getting back to some of the questions about children, we just have a couple of minutes left, and there are a couple of those come in from parents. What's a good conversation starter for race equity with a preteen?
With the preteen, I think it's important to be willing to have conversations about how much that particular preteen knows about individuals who are different than them. Right? Like, so what have you learned in school about people who are different than you? Right? Like, what have we taught you? What have you seen? What happens when, you look on TV? Are there more people that look like you or more people who don't look like you? Why do you think that is? We have to be willing. Let's think about some of the biggest, stars. You have to definitely appeal to what the children are interested in, right? So why do you think, individuals who are of this background are in this particular space or place or time? And why are individuals from this particular background not allowed access to those places and time? Again, it is important for us as parents to not allow our own fears or our own vulnerabilities to keep us from having those difficult conversations. The conversations have to be had, and we have to be willing to say, listen, I don't have all the answers. We have to be willing to say, let's get back to that. Let me go on YouTube, or let me go on a website, or let me find it. Let's table this because I want to be able to give you the information. We have to be willing to do that in order to foster honest and authentic conversations.
Yeah. We also have someone, I'm going to try to unmute her. Give me a second. Andrea, I'm going to try to unmute you if I can, but I don't know if I can. Andrea, I've got you unmuted. You have a question.
Are you talking to Andrea Kennington?
Oh, yes, Andrea, sorry.
No, that's fine. I don't have a question so much as I do comments, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
I think that it is imperative that we, as we talk about race and our common lived experiences with children, that we discuss them from the perspective of this being a human rights issue. Prejudice and racism is not about differences. It is about ignorance, it is about hatred, and it is about fear. And I think that we as social workers, because all social workers aren't created equal, that being said, depending on where you live, so for an example, I am a social worker in North Carolina, even though I'm from the District of Columbia originally, right? And my greatest heartbreak was being among other LCSWs who, like myself, charged with working with children, right? Myself being the only Black person, African-American person on that team, and being around other LCSWs who really did not see Black children and Black people as humans. And I think that we need to be brave, because it's our call to order based on our code of ethics, that we engage with folks about social injustice. And so I think that we have to be brave in standing up and saying to our peers, like, this is a problem. But the other part to that, though, is that as a Black professional, my experience in having done that then trickles down to me as a Black person being the problem, being divisive, not. So I don't want to hold you guys up. I wanted to take part in this conversation. I'm an LCSW. I am the mom of biracial children, a Black woman, African-American woman, having been married to a Caucasian man, not anymore. And what I know is that we must all see this as a human rights issue. And Black Lives Matter is just that. It's about us seeing that Black folks, for the majority, are not being seen as human, and we are dying systematically. The ACE inventory, adverse childhood experiences, right? This is something that can be included in that. And so we get older and we have hypertension and we're dying. And namaste, thank you so much for bringing me on. I'm humbled and honored. Thank you.
Andrea.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Letitia. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Andre, thank you so much for sharing, and thank you so much for your comment, because I think that it is so important. You know, we as social workers have to be willing to confront these issues. We have to be willing to understand that it is not the, Black people that are the problem. It is the racist institutions that are the problem. We have to be willing to go there. So I thank you so much for your comment. Thank you.
I echo that, Andrea. Thank you for joining us from North Carolina and to lending your voice to the conversation. It's really important.
Can I add one more thing? Race identity. You know, there are race identity models and race identity theories. And that being said, I just recently learned about race identity models for biracial children. So it's important that as we discuss these race issues, right, that have to do with human rights, that we engage ourselves in our own knowledge, as well as those that we work with that are clients and other professionals, so that they can know about these race identification models, and we can help children, because biracial, not all, but some biracial children are really, really struggling.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. We're going to look up those resources so that we can share them as well. I think what a great way to sort of wrap us up as well, because we are coming to the end of our hour together, and I know everyone has other meetings or obligation or children to run off to, and I want to be respectful of that time. I just want to thank you all for joining in the conversation. It's taken a couple of different turns, which I really love about these types of dialogues. And hopefully, whether you were a parent or a social worker or a grandparent or somebody from a Facebook group who found out about this conversation, there was something that resonated with you and you're able to take away some tools or just some thoughts that will help you grow as a person, help you in the work that you do with your clients, or even the conversations you're having with your friends and family. Dr. Sampson, I am so incredibly grateful for your expertise and your voice here.
No problem. Thank you so much for this forum and this opportunity. I will share. I saw a couple things come through in the chat. A couple people asked for movies and books, so I will share those things with you via email so that they can be put on the NASW NJ site or Facebook page, so that individuals can see some child-friendly and age-appropriate resources to teach our children about racism.
Yeah, absolutely. So after this conversation, it is being recorded. It's on Facebook. So you can share it with your friends for those who weren't able to participate. It will also be on the NASW New Jersey website under resources. So we have a whole section of our website dedicated to race, responsibility, and reconciliation. So there will be this video as well as the resources. We'll share it there. And we stay tuned. There will be more community conversations. I think we're just at the beginning of doing some really important work together. Thank you all,
so much.
And I hope everyone acknowledges Juneteenth in some way and leans into the conversation a little bit more today. So thank you all, and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.